Okay.
So today I'm just going to talk about component composition in React. So there are two patterns, higher order components, which I'm sure we've all interacted with at some point, and render props, which have gotten a lot of attention recently. So there's a lot of discussion on which is better and when to use what pattern. So I thought I would show a couple examples, and then we can kind of talk about what you guys prefer and maybe see when they would be more useful. Michael Jackson, the React guy, he gave a talk about this because he's like the big render props guy. And he kind of goes over the whole history of component composition. So I was just going to kind of cover that really quickly, which we used to use mix-ins, which were like a system provided by the React create class method. And you could pass the mixins just like as an array. And those mix-ins would have access to lifecycle methods, and they would contribute to the get initial state result. So React system would like intelligently merge all of those lifecycle methods and state. And in that way you could reuse your code and use these mix-ins in different components. So React ultimately abandoned the mix-in system because it got really kind of unwieldy. If you wanted to use more than one mix-in, you would have to be really careful, because if one mix-in tried to set state with the same name as another mix-in, you would have a collision, and it gets really confusing. And there's also the problem of implicit dependencies, where like a method would be called from the mix-in on a component, but the component could also call a method from the mix-in. So it was hard to kind of tell like where things were coming from, and it just introduced a lot of complexity. So to solve that problem, React recommended to use the higher order component pattern, which we've all seen if we've used Redux with the connect component. So the idea with higher order components, it's a pure function. You pass in a component, and then it gives it some state, and then you get it passed back. So the method of composing it uses is wrapping. So like it wraps it in some functionality you want to give, and the state is no longer maintained in that component, but is you interact with it through props instead. So I thought I would just show this example and kind of talk through some of the issues that come up when we use higher order components. So this is actually from that Michael Jackson talk, but I've refactored it to use a higher order component instead of render props. So we could see a comparison. So here I have my function that takes in a component, and here is my wrapper. The wrapper is tracking mouse movement and then providing that as a mouse prop to our component here. So here's
and then it's also maintaining state in the wrapper component, but not the component you passed in.
Right, so yeah, this wrapper is handling all that. Now, here is where I'm actually wrapping that. And I'm setting it to be mouse tracker, and then I'm rendering that here. So now, the first thing you have to remember when you are using a higher order component is props. So in order to actually pass any extra props to this cat, you're going to need to remember to do this here, pass through the props. Because if not, and you wanted to pass some on-click handler here, it's not going to work unless you remember to do this. So another example of that is like if you wanted to use a ref and like actually target this component. That's not going to work right now because refs are treated differently by React. They're kind of like the key prop, so React handles it specially. So what we'd have to do is actually use just a regular prop, like something like this, you could name it whatever. And then you would have to remember to go here and actually pass that ref here, this dot props dot inner ref. So you have to remember to do this. So another kind of interesting thing that happens when you use higher order components is static methods. So if I had, say, cat.nom equals pizza, and then I composed this with the mouse functionality, if I tried to then add or tried to access that, it would not work. Mouse tracker dot. And then let's see. Yeah, so it returns undefined. So what React suggests is that you have to use this library called hoist non-React statics. So to use that, you actually just return that from the wrapper. You pass it your wrapper and then the component that you want to hoist statics from. And let's see. Now you should get it. So that's another thing to remember. So another issue that arises from this is kind of debugging. Yep.
So for like hoist non-React statics,
yep.
What else would be like? So we can use it for any. So it could be used for any method that's kind of outside the class.
Right.
Okay,
so
to specify.
I think it's basically kind of like copying over this, anything that's on this component and hoisting it up to the wrapper. Yeah, so now if we look in dev tools here, wrong dev tools. Yeah, so make sure this works. Here's our mouse, cat. Let's look at dev tools here. So we can see here that we have this wrapper. So you can imagine if you were using a bunch of higher order components, you would see a lot of wrappers and you wouldn't necessarily know like what that's doing. It's just a wrapper. So it doesn't tell you much. So there's this cool trick you can do. You can set a display name. So wrapper display name here. And you can set it to whatever. So it might be more helpful for us if we set the wrapper's display name to something like with mouse. So now if we save that, we can see with mouse instead. And even more helpful would be if we passed in the component name. So this is going to return undefined, and that is because we are passing in a function instead of a class. So to get around that, you can use the just straight up name prop. So we can say, if there's no display name, then use the name prop. So to take care of both of those cases. So now we see that, which is a lot more helpful.
And the name prop is just a standard thing of JavaScript functions.
Right. All right, so then the other thing that you might run into with higher order components is like if you've ever used React Redux, which I'm sure we all have run into, is that it's really hard to test sometimes. Like try to access that wrapped component and get the instance of it. So if you're a nice person and you're writing a higher order component, it's nice to set this, let's see, wrapper, and then we'll say wrapped component, and then we'll set that to component. So if we look at I didn't realize this until I was researching, but React Connect actually, Connect actually does this. So if you ever run into this again and can't access the nested or the wrapped component, you can use this. So if I were testing, then I could just do make assertions on wrapper.wrap component, and that would work. Yeah. So let's see.
I think is that actually how? That's one of the patterns for testing, right? Like instead of what we export. Oh.
Yeah. So I know what you're saying. Yeah, it's often been suggested by libraries that don't implement this to like export the wrap component and the unwrapped component, which is really annoying. Yeah. So this is much cleaner. Yeah. Okay. So there's that. So you can kind of see how like there's a lot of setup to do to like make sure that this is working as expected. And if you look at this here, there's not a lot of information about like where the state is coming from. Like from the site, you actually have to like look at the implementation of it. And then it doesn't actually protect you from name collision, prop name collisions. If you wrapped this again and used another mouse prop, this is like a super contrived example. I don't think you'd ever actually have two mouse props necessarily, but if you did this, this would be broken because the mouse prop is being overwritten. So you have to be careful about naming still, which is a problem that Mixins had that higher order components were supposed to solve, but did not. Okay, so yeah, sad. We talked about all those things. So yeah, any comments or I don't know, notes?
Oh, that was very informative.
Okay, cool. So render props. This pattern is just a way to tell your component that contains state what to render. So you have a component that handles all of your state data transformation stuff, and then you can pass it a prop that says, hey, pass whatever state you've got and render this stuff with it. And it's called inside the render method, but it's much easier to just look at it. Okay, so I'm actually just going to walk through this. I have it right now where it is not using render props or higher order components. It's just straight up rendering the cat. So to refactor this into a render prop, we can move this out. Step one, we'll move this out and we'll call it render cat. Okay, so we've got this render cat method, and now we can call this dot render cat. And let's check this out. Still works as expected. And now we can make this stateless, or sorry, not stateless. We can make this a pure function if we just pass in state here instead. So we can do this. Okay, so now it's a pure function. Still works. Okay, so now that it's a pure function, we don't necessarily need this to be on the class at all. We could like pull this out and we could say render cat. That should still work. Okay, so now we have this pulled out, and this is saying to mouse tracker, here's my component, just pass it some state and render it. So now what's cool is we could actually just pass this as props. So we could say this dot props dot render cat. And down here, can take this. Here. And so convention is, instead of render cat, you could just call it render, and that's a render prop. So let's check, make sure everything's still working. Cool. Does anyone have any thoughts like on seeing this, like how it could be better, or like some of the pros and cons for this versus higher order components?
I don't know about other people, but this is way easier for me to see.
Well, you can name this whatever you want, right? You can name this here. So you're never, you control exactly what that looks like. So there's no, like you're telling this that it's going to be the mouse
because it's
prop.
not even going through the HOC at all.
Right. And then, yeah, so the other, so let's look. I have another example. So we can use whatever, we can pass this as much JSX as you want. And you can tell, you can see where the state's coming from. You can pass it, you know, you can decide what you're going to do with this state. And you can nest this as deeply as you need to, and it's all there. So if we check this out, no, did I save it? Oh, it's back to render cat. So then we got that. Okay, so one of the disadvantages that I've seen people talk about is using this when you are working with React Pure component. Has anyone used that before? It's Pure component. So instead of extending React.component, you would extend React Pure component. So what that does is it automatically implements should component update for you. Does anyone know about that one? So like basically is a tool to optimize your code by telling it when it doesn't need to render unnecessarily. And so what happens when you call this render function in this render prop in a render method, it's creating a new function every time that this mouse tracker is rendered. And so that means that when you use Pure component, it's always going to like return true. And so it'll always, yeah, so that kind of negates the performance gain that you might get from that. Although I think still it seems very negligible.
You can use render props with Pure component.
You can, and so I'm just going to show how you would get around that. It's kind of similar to just like what we did a second ago. So you can say render cat here, and then you would call this here instead, basically. And then here you would say this dot render cat. And that is a way you would get around it. That's the suggestion. But people mostly just recommend if you're going to do this, then don't use Pure component. Yeah. So, but that has been, like, from what I've seen, the biggest complaint about render props is like performance. But then, I don't know, people kind of talk about it without measuring it. So there's no, I haven't seen any actual measurements done, like performance tests, but it seems very negligible to me.
So for testing purposes, you would just look at the render prop and then test the render prop for like whatever you want to see.
Right, you could just, yeah, pass it in. So So we have higher order components which are composed statically, which just means that it's done, here it is, that it's done kind of outside the React lifecycle here. Just happens once and then it's composed and it's done. Whereas render props happen in the render method, so it's dynamic and kind of can take advantage of the full flow of props. And then you can really see where everything's coming from, which we talked about. For me, I was thinking about like, what would it look like if you, because a common thing with higher order components is, you know, say with cat, with mouse, you know, put like keep wrapping it. I think with render props, it looks a little bit messier because to wrap it, it's gonna get pretty unwieldy quickly. But at the same time, you're still seeing exactly where things are coming from, and it's much more explicit. And so that's kind of the trade-off, I guess. Yeah. So the developer composing components owns how the state is passed around. Like we saw here, we could use this mouse state however we wanted among these. Yeah, so there are some like popular libraries using this pattern. First one that comes to mind is React Motion. Now they're implementing it a little bit differently. They're doing it using the function as children pattern, which is basically the same exact pattern, except they're using this.props.children in order to render. So another library is Downshift. This one is much more intense. This example. So this is how they're using a render prop. And they use this thing called prop getters. And this is a way to avoid the name collisions, like common name collisions, like on click, whatever that the API provides, that you might also want to use on your JSX. So yeah, so it seems like the trend is going more towards render props. But yeah, so any thoughts?
So all the regular React lifecycle methods, like component will receive props, those will all apply to render view. Because like you said, for the pure component, that the pure component automatically calls the lifecycle should component update, and then this also like continue calling on unless you are passing the props outside of that instead of passing directly. So like if you name the render props like anything besides render.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, let me find my. So sorry. So
yeah,
you're saying.
So like if the state that I'm passing
Mm-hmm.
on the line body of the mouse, if that's the state I'm passing. Once that updates, it's going to call the render props again.
Mm-hmm.
So
Exactly.
like a regular React lifecycle would render.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of a object versus function-based distinction there. You don't have all those lifecycle looks if you're using a stateless functional component.
Karina, you're referring to the
render method of
the React component that uses the render prop,
Right.
as opposed to the cat component, which could be either or. Okay.
Yeah. So Yeah, I don't have too much more, but I don't know if anyone has any other thoughts about like when maybe one would be better than the other. Yeah.
I definitely think it's a more elegant approach.
Mhm.
It's nice to see the behavior being implemented outside of the higher order component.
For sure.
And then we also know where all the state is being managed, because you can kind of put state in your higher order component and your app component, and you're not really sure where it's coming from when you debug. Right. So yeah, this definitely helps alleviate that.
Yeah.
I mean, they seem kind of like different problems to me. Like to me, a higher order component is maybe you want to bubble up some behavior, but not all of it, to be able to reuse it. I mean, render props to me seem like you're pairing that with something that's purely
Presentational.
presentational.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense.
What do you mean by like bubbling up? Some parts of it and not other
like
things.
just
Something deep rest of the top.
or just lifting up some behavioral aspect, but not all of it.
And why couldn't you do that with this?
I just haven't really seen a clean example, I guess. I mean, like when I look at that downshift thing, like to me that code looks awful.
Right.
It looks like it adds so much complexity that I don't think a junior developer could get in there and do stuff with it.
Yeah, let's look at that again.
Kind of a meta question, but I think React is here to stay for the next couple of years.
Okay.
No, I asked
That's
that.
happy man.
I think it's because we can clearly see that while React is built upon, it's only getting more complex, which I feel like is going to be that opposite direction of why, or at least one of the reasons it was created in the first place.
I mean, this is a pattern, though.
All right, specifically downshift. The stuff that you demoed was like really, really cool. But the downshift, I feel like, is a regression.
I see. Okay.
In the, it's leveraging obviously a lot of the principles of React at the cost of clearly some complexity. So,
Yeah.
although they just have like 3 characters on the line here, it's going to be a lot clearer to read.
Yeah, I think maybe I guess you could pull some of this stuff out into functions that aren't sitting inside of the JSX to make it a little bit easier to read.
But I guess the idea is that you can take these specific props and apply them exactly where you want them to go in this markup.
So isn't the idea usually all that markup will also just be a separate?
Right, you can do
Yeah.
that too. So that there was an article function.
Wait, but why don't you just apply those specifically everywhere else in the higher order?
So you could do that, but then that's how it would be anytime you wanted to reuse it, right? That's how that hierarchy would be set like that.
Okay.
Whereas
So
this,
that's what kind of what
yeah.
Sean is saying. Like,
Okay.
You want to apply your reusability of the lower level. I think that would make sense. So you would, okay, you can pass on the piece of state exactly to whatever render. Okay.
so there's some,
But reading it, yeah, I get it. Reading's not great.
there's some people that, like what you were just saying, Karina, about just passing a component in. The idea is that like, it's like anti-pattern in React to do that because,
So the refresh cycle, probably.
well, I think this is specifically for the function as children solution that React Motion was using, that it's not semantic, basically. It's all, so it's like arguing semantics, but instead to just pass this way. But yeah.
It'd be interesting to see that what you said, what that you haven't seen any performance comparisons with that. Because I've definitely had things where like I wouldn't notice them, like my logic would be messed up, so they kept updating on like something they shouldn't be updating, where there's not enough information, and like you start seeing flickers at times when you should.
Right.
Yeah, so
So are we also using render props because it's easier to isolate the problem? Because like there's a like issue with render and then it's comment on the section and then the rest of that.
I think it's easier to see sometimes.
yeah, for testing definitely. It's like lower level testing is not that hard, but the level trouble have testing is the higher, the complex higher order components are the ones that are hard to test.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can we see that cat again?
Yay.
I was,
Okay, John.
yeah. Tough space. All right. Well, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.